Hello everybody, and thank you so much for joining me back on my channel, Hierarchy of Reads. My name is Tiffany, and today I am here to share kind of a little bit of a two-parter. In the beginning of the video, I'm going to be sharing a little bit of a chatty, though somewhat brief update on where I've been, what I've been doing. If that is not something that you're interested in, that's perfectly okay. In the description box, I'm gonna put the timestamp for when I actually start talking about books, which is the second part of what I'm gonna be talking about today, which is just kind of sharing with you the 5 books that I have read over the past year and my brief thoughts on them. And when I say brief, I mean very, very brief, mainly because for some of these, it has been a while since I've read them, so I don't really remember my detailed thoughts aside from what I was able to find from my notes on Goodreads, because I haven't been annotating, and that's something I need to get back into. But nonetheless, if you want to skip ahead to that part, I'll see you there. For those of you who stuck around, I want to just briefly talk a little bit about kind of where I've been. The last video that I posted, I believe, was in February of this year, and as has been the case, I think, for the past 2 years, I'll come on and I'll make a video and I'll have genuine intentions to come back and start reading and sharing. And then inevitably something happens in life that makes me really not prioritize this channel that much. This channel has always been for me something that I do more as a hobby, as a way to connect with people about books and connect with books, if that makes sense. And so it's something that I have very mindfully kept in that manner, because I never wanted this channel to be something that I despised doing or something that was for the purpose of being productive or to check something off my list. In fact, for a while when my channel did become that way, I hated it, and I purposely wanted to prevent myself from making it about that, right? Because we all need some things in our life that are just for the purpose of our enjoyment, for our leisure. And for a long time, I really struggled with this idea of productivity. Like, every aspect of my life has to be regimented and organized and for the purpose of being productive and for some higher purpose, especially. And that's really just not true. And in fact, when we live our lives that way, it kind of makes life miserable. So I really intentionally have allowed myself to pull myself back. A lot of the reason why I haven't been filming as well is mainly because I've just had so much transition in my life. It's bizarre. I can't even really explain it. I mean, a couple years ago, when I first kind of declined in the amount of videos that I was posting and the amount of reading I was doing, it was because I was finishing up grad school, and that was a lot. And then there was COVID. And then also after that, there were a lot of changes in my personal life that really impacted me in profound ways, good and bad. It was a very big time in my life, and I purposely wanted to read less, because at that time I had realized that while reading is something that I do for my enjoyment and for my betterment in terms of informing and educating myself, it was also something that I did in large part to avoid life sometimes, right? If I can throw myself into this fiction book and talk about it with others, or if I can analyze this concept, this nonfiction concept that has nothing really to do with me personally, then I can distract away from the areas of my life that at the time I didn't really know what to do with. And I realized that's a very unhealthy way to be, and not the way that I personally wanted to be. And so I worked really hard on kind of intentionally reading less for the purpose of being more active and present and intentional in my life. And I have no regrets about that. Like, I have read less in the past couple of years than I have ever read probably in my life. And that's not an exaggeration. And yet I think that was the best decision for me personally, because I was focused more on living my life in vivo than reading about other people's lives. And that was really important for me. With that being said, so I had a bunch of these profound personal life changes, and then things started to settle down again, February of this year, and I was like, okay, I'm all ready to jump right back into reading. I have more time now. I have been reading more, so I'm going to start making videos again. And then I found out that, well, shortly after that, not right then, but shortly after that, I found out that I was pregnant. So this past couple of years has just been a roller coaster ride. So I wanted to give you guys an update on where I've been. It's been a wild ride. I do hope and I do plan, but I make no promises. to come back and to start reading and sharing more. We'll see what happens, I guess. But for those of you who do still watch my videos, I'm really, really glad to have you here with me. And I really hope you interact in the comment section, because genuinely, this is not even just like for YouTube engagement. Like, I love hearing from you guys about what you're reading, what your thoughts are, even kind of general updates on what you're experiencing. So I'm glad to be here. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the books, because in my viewfinder, I see that I am way far in already and I need to get this done because nobody wants to watch a 20-minute video of me talking. Okay. So in this past year, I have dipped in and out of a lot of books. I have finished very few though, but of the ones that I have finished, I want to share them with you. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and start with the ones that I have the least to say about first, in order to kind of get those out of the way. And then we'll go into the one that I have the most to say about, which, like, spoiler alert, is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. So one of the first books that I have the least to say about is I read a poetry collection by Sandra Cisneros called Woman Without Shame. Basically, it says, Without Shame is a moving collection of songs, elegies, and declarations that chronicle her pilgrimage toward rebirth and the recognition of her prerogative as a woman artist. What I'll say is that this poetry collection was not made for somebody like me. So what I'm about to say in a moment is taken with a grain of salt. But this was not for me. I didn't really connect with the poems in here. There were maybe one or two that stuck out. But they just didn't resonate with me. And that's okay. What I did like is that a lot of these, because Sandra Cisneros is of Mexican descent, so a lot of them, they have the poem in English, and then in the page next to it, they have it in Spanish. And because I don't have a lot of opportunity to practice my Spanish lately, I really did enjoy that. And what I will say is that I did enjoy her energy throughout this poetry collection. The next book that I will share that I read this year is Women in Power, a Manifesto by Mary Beard. I read this a few months ago and I did take some notes, but I no longer really remember like why I marked those pages or what. But essentially, this book is kind of an introduction to and an overview of there's a lot of men that really hate women. Surprise, surprise, right? And it's specifically here talking about how men respond to women not just existing, but women having, possessing, and owning power, and how that can oftentimes bring about resentment and violence. And she uses different cases throughout ancient history and even compares to some modern times to exemplify this. It was nothing new, but it was, when I read it, I think I read it in an evening, and I remember just thinking like, yep, that's it, right? Like women, yeah, we get shit for everything. Even just like maintaining power within ourselves, like not even like over others, but just like claiming power to ourselves autonomously, that can, spark a big reaction in a lot of men in society. So it did make me realize that I do really want to read Men Who Hate Women. I think it's by, I don't want to guess the author in case I get it wrong, but I'll link it in the description box below. But I've heard talk about that book being really good too, and this one kind of made me think like it might have similar themes. So that's all I really have to say about this one. The next book that I have to share with you, and I apologize if the angle or the lighting is different, my camera just cut off because I have been talking too much. But the next one I want to share with you, and it's the last nonfiction, is The Selected Works of Audre Lorde, edited and introduced by Roxanne Gay, and I loved this book so much. I love Audre Lorde's writing. I love her voice. I love what she has to say. I'm not going to go too much into it because it's been a couple months since I finished this and I don't have my notes with me. I don't know where I put them. And I would never disrespect Audre Lorde by undermining, even unintentionally, all of the remarkable things that she has to say, by you know, rushing my summary or like BSing the summary. But essentially this is made up of, again, essays and poetry. The poetry, again, didn't land with me as much, but it wasn't written for me, so it kind of makes sense that that would be the case. And also I'm learning that I just don't really get some poetry. It's just what it is. So, but her essays, however, are so, so important. And honestly, this was before the hormones. This was before the hormones kicked in. Her essays oftentimes make me cry. I think I spent a lot of time thinking about, while I was reading her books, like, why am I crying in response to this? Not in a judgmental way, but more so like, what is it that is invoking these tears? And I think I realized it was a bunch of things. Number one, she writes a lot about intersectional feminism, but on a very deep level, on a very human level. And so on one hand, I think oftentimes my tears were a response to just like hearing what she was writing and when she was writing, and that things are so similar. Like, yeah, a lot of things have improved, but in my opinion, and arguably, you know, in some ways it seems like we're moving backwards. And it's scary, but also like just very, very sad. Like sometimes I guess like in the moment I was reading it, I was just thinking like, will things ever change? And how can they actually change, given that so many of the things that withhold all of these things are systemic, and the second you try to change anything systemic, there's really strong retaliation and force for the opposite way. So I think it was a little bit of that, but then also thinking about her experiences specifically and how she writes about them, and just really imagining what her life has been like. I mean, certainly not that it's like all tragic and sad. Of course not. I mean, Audre Lorde has a lot of amazing qualities and has had a lot, it sounds like at least, a lot of amazing life experiences. And I'm not trying to boil down her experience to just like, oh, it's so sad. But it just, I don't know, like it does make me sad how invalidated so many people are systemically and in their personal lives and just in all the different levels of society, and for no reason. Like I think that's one of the hardest parts that I have in accepting, thinking about societal issues, is just like, why? Like these people, so many people are suffering for no reason. Like we cause suffering in others for no reason. And the futility of it all, I think sometimes just gets to me, because in the span of life on earth, right? People's lives are just one small fraction, but for them, that is the whole of it. And there are a lot of people who the greater sum of their experiences are filled with sadness and despair. And it doesn't mean that also beautiful things can exist along with that. But it just, I don't know, sometimes it just makes me sad. Like there's no reason, right? Like why can't, why, it sounds so childlike, but like, why can't we just accept people and support them? So yeah, but on a much deeper level, she really analyzes a lot of things in a very, again, profound and humanistic way. And the way she writes it, chef's kiss. If you've never read Audre Lorde's work, I highly recommend it. All right, the second to last book that I'm going to talk about with you today is The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. Michaelides. We're going to go with Michaelides. If that's incorrect, I apologize. Yeah, this book. This book, I literally think that my review on Goodreads was the eye roll emoji multiple times. This is a thriller, and it's about a woman who is accused of murdering her husband. And then after murdering her husband, she kind of just goes silent and never talks about it again. And there is this criminal psychotherapist who is captivated by her story and goes to work with her to try to uncover what happened and try to get her to talk and connect with her. And it was just really, honestly, the whole book was very gross to me. I will give it one thing. It was interesting in the way that it kept me entertained. But it was just like problem after problem after problem, and I recognize that my perspective is very specific because I very much care about therapy, therapists. I think about all the ethical implications, and there were a lot of ethical implications and red flags in here even before things got more intense, I'll say. And I was reading through this and I'm like, why is this happening? Why? Like, this is not a thing. Or it should not be a thing. Like, it would be a very big red flag thing. Then again, in real life, a lot of red flag things happen. So, yeah, the psychotherapist Theo Faber is gross and icky. Like, he had so many red flags about him from the get-go, really. And it just bothered me because can we have a book or a movie or some representation of a therapist where the therapist isn't just gross? Like, doesn't have boundary issues, doesn't, not to say that they don't have countertransference, because every therapist will have countertransference because they're a human being, but isn't totally unaware of their countertransference and doesn't have, or does have like systems of accountability in place for that. Because I just feel like every single time I read about a therapist, they're like really icky, and it really breaks my heart because yes, there are a lot of icky therapists, but like, can we get one story of like a good one? Just one? So that was my main thing. And also one thing that I wrote in my notes while reading this was something that I wrote in my Goodreads notes, so that's why I'm looking down. And that was that it made a reference, I'm pretty sure it was a direct reference to this, but it might have been indirect, but to BPD, which is bipolar disorder. And on one hand, it was accurate in the way that there's a lot of stigma against BPD, even in the mental health treatment world. And so while on one hand it was very accurate in the way like, yeah, there's a lot of stigma even among clinicians, it was also very, very frustrating. I did not like this book. I would not recommend this book, and I get that I have my own personal issues on it, but those are my thoughts on it. So I have nothing more to say about this. And last but not least, I have A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, a very chunky book that took me a long time to read, not only because it's chunky, but because holy crap, this thing is heavy. And again, I'm not talking about the weight, although it's also heavy that way, but I'm talking about the content of this book. And I knew it was heavy. You all on YouTube told me, not me directly, but it was very popular on YouTube and BookTube or whatever you want to call it a while back. And I listened to a lot of people talk about it, and I remember thinking, I guess I was kind of arrogant about it because I remember hearing people like talk about like, well, it's like trauma porn and it's just like so much, and there's no way that one person in their lifetime could ever go through all of what Jude goes through. And I disagreed with that, mainly because I have a little bit more experience than some other people might have working with people who, I mean, there are people who have experienced a lot of different traumas. And in fact, what we know about trauma, especially developmental trauma, is that when you experience developmental trauma in your life, you're actually more likely to be re-traumatized because of how it impacts, again, like your brain functioning and how you view the world and how you interact with the world. What I will say about this book that I do agree with most of the other people, that at least that I heard talking about this, is that this is kind of unnecessarily heavy in the details about Jude's trauma. I try not to talk too much about exactly what I do on camera, mainly because I want to keep it separate. But what I will say is that I have history working with people with developmental trauma, not unlike Jude's. Obviously not necessarily that exact manifestation. But I've worked with people with all different kinds of developmental trauma, self-harm, suicidal behaviors. Also, I should put a trigger warning because in some of this I'm going to talk about suicide and self-harm behaviors. So if that's something that's going to be really dysregulating for you, please skip this part. But and the level of detail that Hanya Yanagihara writes about Jude's trauma over and over again is really disturbing. Honestly, there's a therapy for trauma. It's called prolonged exposure, where essentially the therapist and the client who has PTSD will talk about the client's trauma over and over and over again, for the purpose of essentially desensitizing to the initial shock and the emotions that come up, for the purpose then of being able to get down to those beliefs and start to challenge some of those beliefs in order to change one's thoughts and narratives about what happened during that traumatic event. And in many ways, reading through this book felt like a session of prolonged exposure, because it's just relentless. We hear so much about these horrid things that happen to the main character, Jude, including like really in-depth descriptions of childhood sexual trauma. And look, I will say that I am not a person who likes to read details about sexual trauma or assault or abuse anyways. It's not that my tolerance is low. I think it's just because like in my reading, I don't need to take that in, right? And I think that in many ways this wasn't needed either. Like the detail, like, okay, if you want to go into it at first to get the idea across, okay. But then after that, like, why are you including these details over and over and over again? I think as a reader, it was really challenging. All right, it cut out on me again. So I'm gonna really try to wrap this up and make it quick because this video is gonna be so long, oh my goodness. Long story short, literally, I think this book went into really heavy details of somebody's traumatic past in a way that started to feel less important for understanding the character and understanding his life, and a little bit more exploitative in the way that the readers are not therapists. They're not Jude's therapists. They don't need to go through that level of detail over and over and over again. Like I said, even for me, it was exhausting. And the other thing I will say, and this is where that trigger warning comes into play, is that I personally, you know, again, I work with people who engage in a lot of self-harm and suicidal behaviors, and that was really not exhausting in the way like that, like, oh, Jude is so exhausting, right? But it was just like, I found myself just really like wanting Jude so bad to like I almost started to think about him as like a real person. I was like, Jude, please go to dialectical behavior therapy, please. Because so many of the clinicians he worked with, at least as they're described in the book, didn't really seem to have an understanding of how to appropriately treat trauma or how to appropriately treat self-harm and suicidal ideation and suicidal behaviors. And in their efforts to protect Jude and support Jude, which I totally get, I think in many ways actually kind of kept and maintained an environment by which his symptoms would never change and get better. And it is true, you can't force people to get trauma treatment, you can't force people to get treatment. And Jude throughout the book was very hesitant to do so. But there's also a lot of therapy modalities that have special techniques to work with people like Jude who have this hesitation, because of course he's going to have hesitation of people, of systems, of everything, really. That part makes sense. But there's ways to build trust in ways that didn't seem like were utilized, or there's techniques to make him feel and actually be seen and validated that in this book, you know, weren't done. And I know this isn't like a book about therapy, but in a way it kind of is. So it was a hard book to read. It was really heavy, and for me it felt kind of like hopeless. And I remember like I got through like to page like 600 something, and I was just like, oh, can this book please be done? But I couldn't like give up on it because I wanted to know what happens with Jude and all his friends and their stories. But it was just I think it was, for me, it was too much, and it didn't need to be. If anybody were to read this book, I think you really have to be aware of your mental state and how it could impact your mental state, and make a informed decision for yourself on whether or not you want to put yourself through that. Yeah, that's all I gotta say. Okay. Anyways, I rambled on a lot more than I thought that I would. I thought that it was going to be brief, but apparently I don't know what the word brief means. So anyways, if you have read any of these books, please let me know what you've thought about them, especially because I know a lot of you have probably read this one, and I'm really curious to hear if you disagree with me on what parts, what you thought of it, what stuck out for you. And actually The Silent Patient, because I think this book was fairly popular a while back too. So I'm curious to hear what you guys thought about any of these, really. Tell me in the comment section below. I really am looking forward to interacting with you. I hope that you're taking care of yourselves. And until the next time, as always, please be well.